Hi, my name is Amy. I'm going to see if I can show you how to quickly put together a quilt using the pillowcase method. Basically what the pillowcase method is a way of avoiding the time-consuming process of putting on a traditional binding. In the amount of time that it would take to cut and pin and sew on a binding, I can whip out 4 or 5 quilts using this pillowcase method. Here's a list of items that you will need to make your quilts. This 1 2/3 yard is also known as a crib size. It's 45 by 60 inches, which is very similar to a throw. A throw is 50 by 60, so just a tiny bit larger. It's a very convenient size because it can work for infants, children. It can also lay nicely on a child's bed. It's nice for adults just as a throw size, and so this is a common size. It's asked for in donations for that reason. It's also easier to make than your larger quilts because it can fit easily on a quilting frame, and you don't have to do any piecing of your fabric because most fabric comes in 45 width, and you can just have it cut in 1 2/3 yards length, and you are ready to start sewing your pieces together. Now, batting comes in a crib size, and it will say that right on the packaging, crib size batting in the prepackaged type, and that's also convenient. Now, I've written here that you can also, I've learned this, that you can use a king size batting, and sometimes that'll be a cheaper way to go, especially when they're on sale, and you can cut it and get 4 very easily 45 by 60 size quilts out of that king size batting. And then you'll have this little remnant here along the side, but if you take these two and sew them together, then you get a 45 by 60. So you get a 5th little crib size quilt out of that batting, and so I love it when that happens. Now, yeah, there will be a seam. But you really don't notice that once you get that quilt together and you get it all tied. It's almost not noticeable. So let's get started. So I don't have a tabletop large enough, so I typically lay my fabric out on my floor. Now these pieces of fabric are a little smaller than the 1 2/3 yards crib size. Most of the fabric that I work with has been donated, so I work with what I have. This is actually a 4-foot long yardstick, so this is about 1 1/4 yards fabric, but this will still work up nicely for an infant, and someone will be very happy to have it. So what we do is you just lay down right sides together. I've got my backing fabric here, and I have my top fabric here, and you put them right sides together. And then we're going to make sure that, and I've kind of already done that, make sure the edges are all trimmed up. Then you're going to lay your batting down, and again make sure that that's about the same size, and then I am going to start pinning first in the middle to anchor that and make sure it's not going to get away from you, and that will become important when we start to sew so that you don't get a lot of shifting. And now I'm going to proceed to pin all along the edges. I typically will pin in the middle, maybe a couple of times in the center area. Then I will pin in the middle on each of the edges, and then work my way to the corner. That's just the way that I have done it. I find that I get less puckering when I do it that way. Kind of smoothing out as you go. You can kind of pull and smooth to make sure that you don't have ripples and things underneath. So here I am at my sewing machine, and I've got it all pinned all the way around. And we're actually going to have the batting down when we start. Now, I actually don't like to start on a corner, and that will make sense in a bit. Now, sewing with the polyester batting like this can be a little fussy. It can get caught and stuck. I tend to just kind of follow it with my hand in the back and try to just work it in as I go. If you're new to sewing, you may want to start with the 100% natural or the soft and natural cotton batting. And even though it looks very thin, it's actually super warm and even warmer than the polyester. And it's a little easier to work with for those of you who are new. Now here's an example of how I've seamed it to try to utilize more batting. This is just a scrap, but here I've seamed it. I just wanted to show you how it really is quite smooth and really doesn't leave a lump there. So you can, you know, piece together your batting and utilize that. So about 5 to 7 inches from where I started my sewing, I'm going to end, and I'm going to back stitch. And that's so we have an area to turn the quilt out. Now I probably made that a little bit small, but because it's thinner batting, it should still work out. So now before we turn it though, we want to remove all of our pins. And don't forget the ones in the middle. That's not something you want to have some little kid find after we, well, you wouldn't be able to turn it actually with those there. You'd figure it out, but get them out before. And then get the pins out, and then we're going to trim the corners. Also, I'm going to go along and I'm going to trim this so it's nice and even. But again, we're just going to just clip off those corners, make sure you don't get into your sewing line. The part where it gets its name, the pillowcase method, is now we are going to turn it right side out. And make sure that when you do that, that you're not putting your hand between the fabric and the batting. You want to have your hand between the two fabrics. So here's your two right sides of your fabric, and you're going to stick your hand in, and I usually go for the furthest corner. You see I've trimmed my edges there, and it doesn't need to be perfect, you guys. We're trying to get as many quilts out as quickly as we can to people in need, and so it doesn't need to be perfection, okay? And then grab that corner, and you're gonna pull it through your opening here. And then I go back in, and don't pull too hard. You don't want to rip your seams, but I go back in and I grab another corner. Now this is easy to do with this size of quilt. This would be more challenging on a larger quilt, but these smaller child-sized quilts work out pretty easy. I forgot to mention as I was sewing along that as you're sewing, you want to occasionally, you know, just look and make sure that your batting is there. You know, now I've trimmed it now, so it's easier to see, but when that fabric was a little bit longer, just make sure that you're catching that batting underneath as you're sewing along. So periodically, just kind of peek as you're sewing. Make sure you're not missing that batting. All right, we almost got it. It's almost like a little reveal when you get it done, and it feels so good. There we go. And so then I usually stand up and shake it out, but I'm afraid if I do that, you'll get a closer look at my messy room. Just find all your corners. And then to get these little points out, what I do is I grab a large embroidery needle and just kind of use it to kind of grab, snag, until you get that sharp point. So once you get all your points pulled out, then what you're left with is this gaping hole here. But you're just going to put your right sides together like that and kind of just work it in and see how nice and even that works. Just kind of falls into place, and then I'll throw a pin in there, generally in the middle first there to anchor that, and throw in a couple more just to keep it in place. Now the nice thing to do, if you had time, would be to blind stitch this, to blind stitch that opening closed. And I'll do that sometimes. If I have a bunch of quilts that I've made to this point and I want to have an excuse to sit and watch TV and not feel guilty about it, I will take a lap full of these and I will do some blind stitching while I'm sitting in front of the television. But I'll be honest, most times I get to this point and then I take it over to my sewing machine And I just do a quick little stitch to close that up. And yeah, it's not as pretty as a little blind stitch, you know, would be hand stitching. But again, a lot of times this is just really about volume and trying to best utilize your time to get as many warm quilts out to people in need. So this is entirely up to you how you decide to close this up. See how quickly that comes together. And I had a little wrinkle there, but I'm not gonna worry about it. It'll work in. Now the last thing that I'm gonna do, once I get my corners all out, and it doesn't matter which side. I usually actually go to the front, so that's gonna be the where you can keep an eye on it and make sure it's pretty. But I'm gonna slip that back under my foot there. And this is up to your preference. I usually go about 3/4 of an inch to an inch in. And this is how you're gonna make a fake binding. And what I mean by that is as you see, I'm gonna start sewing along here. I'm gonna occasionally look at my seams there between my back and my front fabric and just make sure that they're nice and plumb. And then just sew along. Let me get enough here that you can kind of see what we're doing here. So as you look here, you can see that this creates a little fake binding. It kind of looks like a little binding, and it's pretty, but it has another purpose. It also stabilizes the quilt for you, so that when we take it now and put it on our quilting frames to tie, that it already has some stabilizing there. And then, of course, we'll take it to Serving with Smiles or another service organization and put it on some quilting frames, and we can tie this with some yarn. All right, well, look how cute this turned out. As you look here at this this fake binding, it's rather cute, you know, on both sides. So I want to talk to those of you who don't have, you know, quilting frames at home. That's okay. When you have these smaller quilts that you're working with, they can be done just on a counter or a table. Because they're small, you're not going to get as much gathering and puckering, and so you can get away with doing that. The larger you get, the more it really does need to be on frames. If you're just donating them to SW or to Serving with Smiles, then you can just bring them to us at this point, and then we will tie them at our activities. But if you're doing it with your family or another organization and would like to tie them at home, you can do it this way. So let me talk a little bit about these needle threaders. Some people can just, it depends on the size of the needle. There's two different sizes of needles here. Well, there's multiple sizes. Let me see if I can compare that to like my hand. You can see kind of dark, sorry, the difference between these two sizes. Of course, the smaller ones are going to be a little harder to thread. And that's where these needle threaders come in handy. Now, I used this one for years and years, found this one more recently, and I actually prefer this one. It's really easy. So, honey, you want to hold that, and I'll show them how that works. Now, I know for many of you this is pretty rudimentary. You already know how to do this, but just in case, I just want to show you how easy this type is. I like it better because the other one you have to thread to actually thread the needle. This one, on the other hand, you just put it through that little loop there, and then you just, of course it's easier when you're not demonstrating, and then you just pull it right through, and so that's easy to go. Another thing I want to mention is fabric. So when you're using cotton fabrics or flannel, they're pretty easy to stitch through. But if you are using fleeces, which they're great, they feel great, but they're more difficult to work with when you are tying. Because as you're going, when you go to pull it, I'm just going to demonstrate for a minute. When you go to pull it back up with fleeces, see how this bigger needle, it really struggles with the cottons. But when you're using a bigger, we discovered this by accident, but when you are using fleece as the backing, the bigger the needle, the easier it is. And you would think the opposite, but this bigger needle creates a hole, a little bit of a hole in the fabric, not a hole that's going to cause a problem, but it kind of punctures that fabric enough that you can get the yarn through that fleece. So if you're using fleece as a backing, I recommend the larger needles. Whereas if you're using just your cotton and your flannels, the smaller needles are easier to work with. They go in and out easier. So let me just demonstrate how, when you're doing it on your counter or a table, how you can use or the stitch that we'll do. So make sure that your yarn is nice and even there, as even as you can there. And I like to start somewhere in the middle. Now, if you're lucky enough to have a patterned fabric, and then you can just, like, and this one, for example, I'm just going to go down in all the baskets, and that's about 4.5 inches apart, which is, you don't want anything less than about 4.5 inches apart. And as you know, the reason that we tie a quilt or that we hand quilt a quilt or machine quilt a quilt is because it stabilizes the layers. If you do not tie or quilt a quilt, then the first time you throw it in the washing machine and the dryer, it's going to come out a big bunch, just a mess. All the batting's going to be shoved down into one corner, and you no longer will have a quilt. You'll have some messed up version of a pillow, and then it's ruined. So this is why we need to quilt. And about every 4.5 inches, like I say, no more than that, because you need that stability. So again, when you don't have it on a quilting frame, when it's not a quilting frame, you start at the end. You start down at the end near the seam. But when you're not, I would start in the middle so that you're stabilizing your quilt. So we can just start on one of these baskets, and the first one you're gonna just pull through, and you're gonna tie a square knot. Just with your hand like that. Now we're just gonna get a little easier after this first one, and then back the other direction. So you just got a square knot going on, okay? Now, let me pause for just a minute and say that I'm just using regular yarn. Now these look like the same, but this one here is actually the baby yarn or the sports yarn. Sometimes it's called sports yarn. Now this is the slicky, soft, and it seems so tempting to want to use because it's so soft and so beautiful. But this, when you go to throw this into the washing machine, it comes untied so much easier. It just it's slippery. And so it comes out of the stitching, and it doesn't hold up to repeated washings. And so I don't recommend this for tying. Now, if this is yarn that you have and and you're trying to utilize what you have, then if you are using the sports yarn or the baby yarn, then you're going to want to go down again. So it's a little more labor intensive. So after you've tied, you've done one knot, you're going to actually go down again, and you're going to tie another one. And that's just to give it that added stability. So, and you can just do it like so. You're just basically creating a second knot. But again, if you're using regular yarn, that's really not necessary. But if you're using the slicky yarn, then you'll want to do that. So once you've got that first knot going, and since I'm not using the baby yarn, I'm using regular yarn, I'm only going to do the one knot from here on out. And I'm going to just go in all the baskets. So if you are picking out fabric and you have a choice, then try to pick out something that maybe you don't have to mark, that you can just, go in, a pattern. Like if it's, squares or lines, you can kind of go, kind of eyeball it. With this, like I say, I'm just going to go in all the baskets. But, sometimes like with me, I get my fabric donated, and so you are just glad to get what you get, and that's great too. And so that's when I will, measure and put little dots with fabric markers that wash out, and you'll have little dots every 4.5 inches that you'll know where to go down into. So, as far as donated fabric, I want to touch on that a little bit. So the places that you can get fabric are just almost endless. You can look on Facebook Marketplace. So many times people are cleaning out their grandma's house because she's passed away, and they're practically giving away fabric. You can start asking your grandmas and your moms and your mother-in-laws and your neighbors, and tell them that you're making quilts for donation, and they would be happy to give you some. And that's how I've gotten most of my donated fabric, is by word of mouth. People find out that you're donating to a good cause, and they are just excited to donate. And so you can get a lot of fabrics that way. So here's, I'm going in the baskets. I was just going to show you, sorry. When you're teaching younger kids, when I do it, you get fast and you just kind of do it and you don't think about it. But when you're teaching younger kids, what I teach them is you're going to do a backwards E. Okay, see how you see that E, and you go underneath. That's your first little loop. Then you're going to do an upside down E. See that? And you're going to go underneath. And that really sticks with kids. They kind of get that. And you have to guide them a little bit, but they figure it out. The other thing, too, is you want to periodically, whether it's on a quilting frame or, on a table, is make sure that they're not leaving big loops, underneath. That's, when you have kids, inevitably you're going to have some loops and you have to go cut them out and redo them. But that's okay. So there you go. Good, happy quilting.